Chris Dickerson is one of the least discussed figures in the history of competitive bodybuilding, despite a career that placed him at the top of the sport. He was the first black man to win the Mr.Olympia title, the first openly gay champion, and the oldest winner the competition had ever seen. What brought him to that stage and what followed remains largely absent from the sport's popular history. Henry Christophe Dickerson was born on August 25, 1939 in Montgomery, Alabama, the youngest of triplets. His mother, Mahala Ashley Dickerson, became the first black female attorney in the state of Alabama, a distinction that, given the legal and social conditions of the era, required considerable persistence. She went on to work as a civil rights advocate alongside figures central to that movement. His father began his career as a bellhop at the Jefferson Davis Hotel and later became head of transportation at Ohio's largest bank. His parents divorced when Chris was young, and it was primarily his mother's example, disciplined, determined, and self-reliant, that shaped his early sense of the world. Bodybuilding was not part of that picture. When Dickerson graduated from Olney Friends School in 1957, his interests were in performance and the arts. In 1959, he enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City, where he studied acting, singing, and ballet. His ambitions at the time were oriented toward opera. That changed when a teacher redirected his focus and set him on an entirely different path. His instructor noticed something in his voice. The chest wasn't strong enough to support the kind of powerful projection opera demanded. The advice was straightforward: build physical strength and the voice would follow. It was one of the more accidental pivots in bodybuilding history. Chris picked up a magazine and came across Bill Pearl, Mr. Universe, and one of the most striking physiques the sport had produced. Something shifted. The opera ambition didn't vanish, but it began to share space with a new focus. Chris wanted to build something with his body that carried the same discipline and craft as the music he had devoted himself to. At 24, an age when most competitive bodybuilders were already years into serious training, Chris Dickerson entered a gym with real intent for the first time. He relocated to Los Angeles, took a job as a hospital orderly to cover his expenses, and sought out the man from the magazine. Bill Pearl was selective about who he trained, but something in Dickerson stood out. His attitude, his discipline, his seriousness. Pearl brought him into his program, and the work began. It would become one of the more significant mentor-athlete relationships the sport had seen. The world Chris Dickerson was entering was largely white, predominantly straight, and skeptical of anyone who fell outside a narrow physical standard. Dickerson fell outside that standard in nearly every dimension that carried weight in competition. His height was the first obstacle. At 5'6", he was shorter than virtually every elite competitor in the field. Judges at the time favored tall, imposing physiques, broad and architecturally dramatic. A shorter athlete needed to be essentially flawless to compete against someone 6 inches taller, because the eye naturally moves toward scale and presence. His race was the second. It was 1963. The civil rights movement was reshaping American society through confrontation and resistance. Black Americans were being denied basic civic and human rights across the country. Within that context, Dickerson was stepping onto a stage in front of predominantly white judges and audiences, asking them to evaluate his body as a competitive ideal. The resistance he faced wasn't only personal, it was structural. His sexuality was the third. Chris Dickerson was gay. The bodybuilding world of that era was intensely masculine in its culture, hostile toward homosexuality, and intolerant of anything that challenged its definition of manhood. There was no explicit rule barring gay competitors, but the culture surrounding the sport made clear that visibility came at a cost. He knew all three of these things. He spoke about them openly, though mostly in reflection. Years later, he understood that his race and sexuality would shape how people perceived him, but it was his height that concerned him most, because height could influence how judges scored him, and that was beyond his control. He trained anyway. In 1965, 2 years into serious training, Chris entered his first competition, the Mr. Long Beach contest, and placed third. He was happy, genuinely happy. He kept that trophy among his most sentimental possessions for the rest of his life. Not because of what it said about his standing in the sport, but because of what it meant to demonstrate to himself that this was possible. The wins followed. 1966 marked a turning point. After the third place finish at Mr. Long Beach, Chris returned to the East Coast and entered 12 separate competitions. He won all 12. For someone only 3 years into serious training, that record was without precedent. The bodybuilding world took notice. By the late 1960s, his name was appearing in magazines. He was developing a reputation not only as a competitor, but as a showman. Someone who understood that posing was its own discipline, that presenting a physique depended as much on performance as on the muscles themselves. His background in ballet and theater was not incidental to his bodybuilding career, it was central to it. He moved on stage with a grace and intentionality most competitors didn't have, because they hadn't been trained the way he had. In 1967, he won the Mr. California title. In 1968, the Mr. USA. By 1970, he was competing for the AAU Mr. America, the most prestigious amateur bodybuilding title in the country. Chris Dickerson won it. He was the first black man ever to win the AAU Mr. America. The response was immediate. The press drew comparisons to Jackie Robinson, who had broken baseball's color barrier 2 decades earlier. What Chris had accomplished was not only an athletic achievement, it was a cultural one. He was invited to speak at events, appear on television, and give interviews across the country. The title had opened a door that most people assumed was closed to a black athlete in that sport. To Chris, it felt like, as he later described it, the impossible dream. Winning Mr. America was not the end of that journey, it was the beginning. There's a chapter of Chris Dickerson's story that most people who know his name have never heard. While Arnold Schwarzenegger dominated the Mr. Olympia stage throughout the first half of the 1970s, Dickerson was doing something unusual. He left. Not permanently and not in defeat, but he stepped away from the American bodybuilding circuit and went to Europe, where he competed in non-IFBB organizations and won titles that, while prestigious on their own terms, received little attention from the mainstream American bodybuilding press. He won the NABBA Pro Mr. Universe in 1974, a legitimate world-class title, and earned wide respect in European bodybuilding circles. Beyond the competitions, what was unfolding in his private life during this period was something the sport was simply not prepared to discuss. Chris Dickerson was openly gay, not publicly political about it in any activist sense, but genuinely and quietly open about who he was in his personal life. He had relationships. He lived as himself. This was during a period when homosexuality was still classified as a mental disorder in official US medical literature. The Stonewall riots had occurred in 1969, but the cultural shift that followed was slow and uneven. Within bodybuilding, there was an unspoken agreement not to acknowledge the obvious. The sport had long included gay athletes, gay judges, and gay promoters, and the knowledge or strong suspicion was widespread. Nothing was said. When Dickerson became Mr. Olympia in 1982, the press did not print a single word about his sexuality. Not because it was a secret, but because the sport had collectively decided this was not a conversation it was willing to have. During his time in Europe, Dickerson also continued to pursue his long-standing interest in music and performance. He sang the national anthem at bodybuilding events and maintained his connection to opera and theater. He had come to bodybuilding from the arts, and that background remained a consistent part of who he was. In time, the draw of competing on the sport's largest stage proved difficult to set aside. In 1979, at the age of 40, Chris Dickerson made his first appearance on the IFBB professional stage. He entered the Canada Pro Cup and won it. At that year's Mr. Olympia, he placed 4th in the under 200-pound class, with Frank Zane taking the title. But the performance established something clearly. Dickerson was there to compete. In 1980, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had retired from competition in 1975 after winning 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles, announced he was returning. He hadn't competed seriously in 5 years. He arrived in Sydney, Australia with a physique widely acknowledged to be notably softer than his peak condition. Dickerson was in arguably the best shape of his life. The judges awarded the title to Arnold. The response was sharp and immediate. Mike Mensa, one of the era's most accomplished bodybuilders, retired from competition on the spot and publicly stated the judging was corrupt. Many competitors and observers shared that view. Arnold's win has been debated ever since, some defending it on the basis of stage presence and competitive legacy, others describing it as one of the most blatant cases of favoritism the sport had seen. Chris Dickerson placed second. In 1981, the pattern repeated. Franco Colombo, Arnold's close friend, also returning from years away from competition, took the title in Columbus, Ohio. The judging was again questioned. Dickerson placed second again. By any reasonable assessment, he had been the best bodybuilder on the Olympia stage 2 years running and had nothing to show for it. He was 42 years old. He had spent his adult life working toward that title. He considered quitting. But a judge close to the competition advised him to stay, telling him the title was his if he continued, and that he was too accomplished to let the sport's politics end his career on someone else's terms. He came back. The 1982 Mr. Olympia was held in London, England. Chris Dickerson was 43 years old. He entered that competition, as he later described it, knowing it was do or die. Bill Pearl was in the audience, seated in the front row. Pearl was the man who had discovered Dickerson in a gym 2 decades earlier, who had spent years training and advising him. His presence meant something. Pearl had invested in this athlete as much as any coach in the sport's history, and both men understood what the night represented. When the final scores were tallied, Chris Dickerson was named the 1982 Mr. Olympia. He lifted the trophy above his head and looked down into the front row. Bill Pearl was smiling, all smiles, as Dickerson later recalled, and in that moment, decades of work converged into a single result. He was 43 years old, the oldest Mr. Olympia in history. That record would stand for 36 years until Sean Roden broke it by just 4 months in 2018. Dickerson was the first black Mr. Olympia, the first openly gay Mr. Olympia, and one of the shortest men ever to win the title. He had begun training seriously at 24, later than almost any elite champion before or since. The mainstream press covered the win as the story of an older champion finally receiving his due. They reported his race, they did not report his sexuality. Not a single mainstream outlet in 1982 noted that the new Mr. Olympia was a gay man, a fact that was not a secret within the bodybuilding world. The silence was deliberate and complete. In the years that followed, Dickerson spoke about this carefully and without much bitterness. He was not an activist, and he had no interest in making his personal life a political statement. He had lived as himself, and the world around him had chosen to treat part of that identity as though it did not exist. That dimension of his story remains difficult to set aside because it raises a question the bodybuilding community has never fully answered. What does it mean to celebrate an athlete's achievements while simultaneously erasing who that athlete actually is? Bodybuilding has long had an uneasy relationship with the gay community. The sport is built on a specific aesthetic of masculinity, or at least a particular performance of it, and there has historically been significant anxiety around anything that complicates that image. Gay athletes have competed at the highest levels for decades, promoters have been gay, judges have been gay, and yet the culture of silence around that fact was enforced so thoroughly that the first openly gay Mr. Olympia winner held that distinction for nearly 4 decades before it received serious attention in mainstream coverage. Chris Dickerson was never secretive about who he was. In the gay community, particularly in California where he lived and trained, he was known and respected. His work with photographer Jim French during the 1970s, which circulated in gay publications and artistic circles, was openly acknowledged. But the bodybuilding mainstream treated these two aspects of his identity as separate, a division that has only begun to be honestly examined in recent years. When he discussed it in interviews later in life, there was no bitterness in his voice. He appeared genuinely at peace with how his career had unfolded. He believed that his approach, conducting himself with dignity and without confrontation, had been the right path for him. Not everyone agreed. Some felt he deserved recognition as a trailblazer across multiple dimensions at once, not only in the areas the sport found acceptable. The barriers he crossed were real and significant. He broke a color barrier, he broke an age barrier, and he lived an authentic life in a sport that was not prepared to honor it publicly. Whether that constitutes quiet triumph or quiet tragedy likely depends on the individual you ask and what weight they assign to visibility. When most people think of Mr. Olympia winners after retirement, they picture supplement deals, coaching careers, guest appearances, and the Arnold Classic circuit. Chris Dickerson's post-competition life looked nothing like that. He continued competing occasionally, placing 11th at the 1984 Olympia, appearing at the 1990 Arnold Classic at age 50, and then winning the over 50 division at the 1994 Masters Olympia at age 55. That victory made him a title holder in both the Open Mr. Olympia and the Masters Olympia, a distinction shared by only one other competitor in the sport's history, Dexter Jackson. After 1994, he retired from competition. Rather than remaining in the spotlight, he moved in a quieter direction. He worked in corporate security for Citrix Corporation in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, not as a spokesperson or a brand representative, but as an actual security officer. The most decorated bodybuilder of his era held a day job that most people would never associate with someone of his standing in the sport. He continued giving seminars and coaching. He occasionally sang the national anthem before bodybuilding events, still performing, still connected to the theatrical side of himself that had begun with an opera teacher's offhand suggestion to strengthen his chest. He relocated to Fort Lauderdale in 2006, and by all accounts was content with the life he had built there. In 2000, he was inducted into the IFBB Bodybuilding Hall of Fame, a recognition that had taken years to arrive and one he accepted with the same composure that had marked his entire career. In 2012, he contacted the Stark Center for Physical Culture and Sports at the University of Texas at Austin and arranged to donate his complete bodybuilding memorabilia collection, his trophies, photographs, records, and personal history to their archives. The decision was not about financial gain. It was about preservation and about ensuring that future generations would have access to the physical record of what he had accomplished. He had attended the Stark Center's 2011 opening of the Joe and Betty Weider Museum of Physical Culture, standing alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger, Larry Scott, Lee Haney, Ronnie Coleman, and Frank Zane, figures who had shaped the sport he helped build. A year after that occasion, he took steps to ensure his own contribution would be maintained beyond his lifetime. That was Chris Dickerson. In 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted life across the world, Chris Dickerson, then 80 years old, was dealing with a separate and immediate problem. He had broken his hip. For anyone at that age, a broken hip is a serious injury. For a man whose life had been defined by physical discipline and athletic achievement, it carried additional weight. He had spent 3 decades building one of the most admired physiques in the history of competitive bodybuilding. He had outlasted many of his contemporaries, and navigated decades of prejudice, political bias, and inconsistent judging. Now his body was failing in a way that had nothing to do with competition. He moved into a retirement facility in Fort Lauderdale. The broken hip weakened him, and complications from COVID-19 further slowed his recovery. The combined strain placed significant pressure on his heart. On December 23, 2021, Henri Christophe Dickerson died in a hospital in Fort Lauderdale. He was 82 years old. The cause of death was heart failure. The bodybuilding community responded with genuine mourning. Sean Ray, who had known Dickerson since 1982, wrote a tribute reflecting what many in the sport felt, that Dickerson had reached the top of a demanding profession with integrity, kindness, and dignity, and that he had opened doors for athletes who were poor, black, gay, and short, that he was in every sense of the word, a champion. Outside of bodybuilding circles, however, the coverage was limited. There was no major television tribute, no significant moment of recognition in mainstream media. The man who had been the first black Mr. Olympia, the first openly gay champion of any major professional sport of that era, and the oldest winner of the most prestigious title in his field, passed with relatively little public acknowledgement. The quiet that surrounded his death was in many ways consistent with the quiet that had surrounded much of his career.